I never thought I'd be questioning my own family, let alone fearing for my life in my own kitchen. Every morning, I would sip my coffee and feel a wave of nausea, dizziness, and fatigue that seemed to get worse with each passing day. My brother, whom I had trusted all my life, acted completely normal, even cheerful, while everyone around me dismissed my growing concerns as paranoia. Little did I know, what I was experiencing was not in my head. It was the beginning of a terrifying revelation that would shatter everything I thought I knew about family, trust, and betrayal. My name is Claire Dawson, and this is the story of how my own brother tried to poison me day after day, and how the truth finally came out, proving that sometimes the people closest to you are capable of unimaginable cruelty. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It all started about 6 months ago, in our family home in Ashford, a small suburban town in Ohio. I had moved back in temporarily after a tough breakup, hoping to reset my life and get some stability. My brother, Ethan Dawson, had always been a fixture in my life. We grew up sharing secrets, rooms, and sometimes clothes, and I thought we had an unshakable bond. But it didn't take long for me to notice something strange. Every morning, I would wake up with a pounding headache, my stomach unsettled, my hands trembling slightly, and an unusual taste lingering in my mouth after finishing my first cup of coffee. At first, I'd chalked it up to stress or maybe my old habit of drinking coffee on an empty stomach. But the symptoms were becoming more frequent, more severe, and more specific to the mornings I had coffee made by Ethan. Ethan had recently taken over the morning coffee routine in our household, claiming it was my gift to you since I had been stressed and exhausted. At first, I appreciated the gesture. He would grind the beans himself, choose fancy syrups and creamers, and hand me a steaming cup before I even made it to the kitchen counter. But there was something off. He always watched me drink it, his eyes lingering a second too long, a faint smirk that I couldn't quite place. I started keeping mental notes. Some mornings I would feel fine after drinking coffee from the office downstairs or from a local cafe, but at home it always hit me. Fatigue, nausea, mild vertigo, every single time. I tried to dismiss my instincts. "You're just stressed," my cousin Mara told me over the phone one evening when I confessed how sick I felt. My mom echoed the same sentiment, brushing it off as Claire being dramatic like she always is. Even my friends laughed when I mentioned my suspicion that Ethan might be tampering with my coffee. It was exactly what I feared. Everyone, including the people I trusted the most, thought I was imagining it. That made me question myself constantly. Was I really paranoid, or was something truly wrong? Despite everyone's dismissal, I began paying closer attention. I started keeping a log of the mornings I felt unwell, noting the time, the symptoms, and what I had eaten or drunk. It quickly became clear there was a pattern. The symptoms only appeared when I drank coffee that Ethan had prepared. It wasn't random. Something was happening in that cup, and Ethan was the common denominator. My stomach churned at the thought, but I had to be cautious. I couldn't just accuse him outright. That would ruin me if I was wrong. I had to gather evidence, and I needed to protect myself in the meantime. I started secretly preparing my own coffee one morning while Ethan was in the shower, and for the first time in weeks, I felt fine. That confirmed it. Something in his preparation was making me sick. My heart pounded as I considered the implications. Why would my own brother do this? What could possibly motivate someone to slowly poison a family member? Fear, jealousy, resentment? None of the usual sibling rivalries made sense. Ethan had a steady job, a happy social life, and by all accounts, there was no reason for him to target me. But the proof was there, staring at me in the face with every morning that I felt ill after drinking his coffee. I tried to confront him subtly. "Hey, do you mind if I make my own coffee for a while?" I asked one morning, hoping to gauge his reaction. Ethan laughed a little too easily. "Sure, Claire, if that makes you feel better. I just thought you liked it how I make it," he said, shrugging. There was no remorse in his tone, no hint that he understood the seriousness of the situation. That laugh, it still haunts me, was the first real crack in the facade of the brother I thought I knew. I knew then that I couldn't rely on family opinions or their reassurances. I needed objective proof. I had to find a way to catch what was being done to me, and I had to do it without alerting Ethan. My fear grew daily, as did my suspicion. Every sip of coffee in my presence became a moment of dread. Each morning I wrestled with anxiety before drinking, unsure whether I would end up sick again or whether today would be different. And deep down, I knew that the people who should have supported me, my family, would never believe the truth until it was undeniable. So I started planning. I discreetly set aside cups, labeling them with the day's date and time, and researched local laboratories that could perform a toxicology screen on beverages. I wanted proof that would silence anyone who said I was overreacting. I even considered confiding in a close friend to help me collect evidence without Ethan knowing. But one thing was clear. I was on my own in this. If Ethan was really trying to harm me, I couldn't wait for someone else to notice. I had to act before it was too late. By the end of that first week, the reality hit me with terrifying clarity. My life, my health, and my sense of safety were being compromised by someone I had trusted above all else. The brother who had once been my protector had become the source of my daily suffering, and the question of why he was doing it remained unanswered. All I knew for certain was that I could not let this continue. The poison, whatever it was, had to be stopped, and the truth had to come out. But I also knew this would be just the beginning of a long, painful journey, one that would test my courage, my relationships, and my very sense of reality. Life at home grew increasingly tense as I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, while secretly suspecting that every cup of coffee could be laced with something harmful. I moved carefully through the kitchen, observing Ethan's every movement, trying to spot any suspicious behavior. But he was meticulous. He never gave away a hint, always smiling, always chatting casually, as though nothing was wrong. My parents, David and Elaine Dawson, were blissfully unaware, or so it seemed, accepting Ethan's morning gestures with the kind of fondness that made my unease feel almost ridiculous. "Claire, you're imagining things," my father said one morning, waving me off as I complained of nausea. "You're overthinking. Ethan's just trying to help." Even my younger sister, Lily, chimed in with a giggle, telling me to stop making mountains out of molehills. I felt isolated, trapped in a household where my own body was betraying me, yet no one would take me seriously. To cope, I began to develop routines, almost like a scientist observing an experiment. I kept a detailed journal of every symptom, the intensity, the time of day, the coffee I had consumed, even the type of mug I used. Sometimes I would switch cups, claiming I had misplaced mine, and noted the results. The patterns were undeniable. The symptoms only appeared when Ethan made the coffee. On the days I prepared my own, I felt normal, healthy, alert. That realization was both a relief and a terrifying confirmation. Someone in this house wanted to hurt me, and that someone was someone I trusted the most. I also started reflecting on Ethan's behavior over the past year. Subtle things I had ignored before now seemed like potential red flags. He had been unusually controlling over my schedule, offering to help with work and errands, insisting I eat and drink things he had chosen, always with a veneer of concern that now seemed sinister. He had a way of inserting himself into my routines, of making his presence indispensable. At the time, I had welcomed it. What sibling wouldn't want help from someone close? But the pattern was emerging clearly. Wherever Ethan was involved, I felt worse afterward, and the discomfort was escalating. I also began to notice Ethan's subtle manipulations of the family dynamic. He would smile knowingly at our parents when I voiced concerns, often twisting my words in front of them to make me sound irrational. "Claire's just stressed about work," he would say, his voice calm and authoritative, as if to reassure everyone that she was overreacting. I started documenting these interactions, recording conversations on my phone when I could, and taking mental notes of the times and situations in which he subtly undermined me. The more I observed, the clearer it became. Ethan had cultivated a version of reality in which I was always the unstable one. It was frightening how effectively he could manipulate perception while maintaining the guise of the caring, helpful older brother.
At this point, I realized that I needed a controlled way to test my theory without alerting him. I started preparing 2 cups of coffee, identical in appearance, but only drink the one I made myself. The effects were consistent. My own cup caused no symptoms, and the other, the one from Ethan, made me feel ill. The proof was mounting, but I still needed objective confirmation. I began researching toxicology labs in Ashford and neighboring cities, looking for a discreet way to test the coffee. Some labs required formal documentation or identification from a medical professional, which made the logistics tricky. I even considered paying for an independent lab online that would ship results to me. But I knew I had to be careful. If Ethan suspected I was onto him, it could escalate the situation. Meanwhile, I attempted to maintain a semblance of normal family life, even laughing at Ethan's jokes and joining in on family dinners. On the outside, everything appeared ordinary. He would casually chat about work, sports, and local news while I sat silently, tension coiling in my stomach. I found myself constantly calculating my next move, thinking about how to collect evidence, and strategizing how to confront him safely if it came to that. I avoided drinking coffee in front of him whenever possible and even started carrying my own sealed thermos to avoid accidental contamination. I also reached out to a few close friends anonymously, describing my symptoms and the pattern I had observed. They were supportive, but their advice was cautious. "Claire, you have to be careful. Make sure you have evidence before accusing anyone." That was frustrating, but it was also a reminder that I couldn't rely on anyone else to validate my instincts. I had to gather the proof myself. Each day that passed felt like a ticking clock, a test of patience and resilience. My fear of Ethan's intentions, coupled with the disbelief of my family, created a constant state of vigilance that I could not escape. By the end of that second week, I had gathered enough circumstantial evidence to convince myself of one inescapable truth. Someone in my family was deliberately harming me, and the person responsible was my own brother. It was a revelation that filled me with dread, but also a strange sense of clarity. For the first time, I understood the stakes and the enemy I was facing. I couldn't wait for anyone else to see the truth. The only way forward was to continue documenting, to stay alert, and to find definitive proof that could not be dismissed or rationalized away. The plan was forming in my mind, and though the road ahead seemed long and dangerous, I knew that uncovering the truth was not optional. It was essential for my survival. It was a Thursday morning when the situation finally reached a point that could no longer be ignored. I had been meticulous with my notes, careful to avoid suspicion, and had begun quietly preparing a strategy to confirm what I already feared. Ethan was poisoning my coffee. That morning, I followed my usual routine, pouring my own cup first to establish a control, then pretending to drink the one Ethan had prepared. Within minutes, the familiar wave of nausea hit me like a hammer. My vision blurred slightly, my stomach knotted, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. This time, however, the symptoms were more intense than usual. I barely managed to get to the sink before retching violently, gripping the counter for support as panic surged through me. Something had changed, the dosage, the method, or perhaps his timing, and it was clear that I couldn't afford to wait any longer. I stumbled into the living room, my body trembling, and looked at Ethan, who was leaning casually against the wall with that same easy smile. "Are you okay, Claire?" he asked, his tone dripping with concern, but there was a subtle glint in his eyes that made my skin crawl. I forced a weak smile, hiding the panic, knowing that showing fear could provoke him. My mind raced. I needed help, someone outside the household, but I couldn't risk involving family. They still thought I was paranoid, and Ethan would surely manipulate them to his side. I remembered Dr. Reynolds, my doctor, who had been supportive before. Maybe she could help, but I needed concrete evidence, something undeniable that wouldn't allow anyone to dismiss me as overreacting. That same day, I decided to take a bold step. I discreetly collected the coffee from the previous mornings that had made me sick, labeling each cup by date, and carefully sealed them in containers I had purchased specifically for evidence preservation. I made sure to avoid touching the contents directly, wearing gloves, and double-checking each container for leaks. My plan was to take them to a private toxicology lab the next day, one that guaranteed confidentiality and could provide a detailed chemical analysis. The anticipation was terrifying. If the lab confirmed my suspicions, I would have definitive proof that my own brother had been deliberately trying to harm me.
That evening, I tried to engage Ethan in casual conversation, watching for any slip or hint of guilt. He was calm, composed, and unusually charming, recounting a story about his day at work with perfect timing and emphasis. He had always been charismatic, but now his charm felt like a weapon, a way to disarm suspicion and maintain control. I noticed how effortlessly he shifted the family's attention away from me whenever I tried to bring up any minor health concerns, steering the conversation toward irrelevant topics or cracking a joke at my expense. Every laugh from my parents or sister felt like a dagger, reinforcing the isolation I felt. It was maddening, but it also clarified one thing. Ethan had been planning and manipulating this for some time. That night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, the reality hit me fully. This was not a passing issue, nor was it a minor sibling prank. This was a deliberate, calculated attempt to harm me. I thought back to every time I had felt ill, every morning when I had questioned my own sanity, and realized just how much control he had exerted over my daily life, without anyone noticing. My fear was matched by a resolve I hadn't known I possessed. I could not let this continue, not only for my own safety, but also to ensure that no one else could be blindsided by someone so close, turning so cruel. I began drafting a mental plan. Collect evidence, approach a trusted medical professional, and prepare for confrontation. The next morning, I executed the first step. I went to the toxicology lab, keeping my composure while handing over the sealed coffee samples. The lab technician was professional and discreet, explaining that results could take a day or two, but that they would be detailed enough to detect toxins, heavy metals, and other harmful substances. As I left, I felt a mix of dread and relief. The waiting period was agonizing. I couldn't tell anyone in my household what I was doing, and every interaction with Ethan was laced with suspicion. He greeted me with a cheerful, "Morning, Claire," and I forced a response, watching his expression for any flicker of recognition. There was none. He seemed untouchable, invincible in the guise of normalcy. Over the next 24 hours, I felt like I was walking on a knife's edge. Every cup of coffee, every casual touch or smile from Ethan, every comment from my parents or sister was scrutinized. I barely slept, constantly imagining scenarios of confrontation or exposure. I reviewed my notes repeatedly, making sure my records were complete, noting times, symptoms, and any variations in how I felt. I also mentally rehearsed what I would say to the lab or Dr. Reynolds once the results came back, knowing that I would need a clear, objective explanation that could withstand scrutiny. Finally, the phone call came. The lab technician's voice was calm but precise, confirming that they had identified a toxic substance in several of the coffee samples I had provided. The exact chemical compound was something I had never heard of before, a slow-acting agent that could have caused cumulative damage over time. The nausea, dizziness, and fatigue I'd experienced were consistent with exposure to this substance. I felt a mixture of vindication and horror. My fears were validated beyond a shadow of a doubt, but the reality was terrifying. My own brother had been deliberately poisoning me, and it had been happening for months without anyone noticing. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, processing the confirmation. I could no longer rely on family understanding or casual denial. The situation had escalated from suspicion to undeniable proof. I had reached a critical juncture, the breaking point. From this moment onward, nothing could remain the same. I knew that I had to act decisively, but carefully, because the consequences of revealing this truth could be explosive. My safety, the family dynamic, and my own sense of reality were all on the line. The path forward was uncertain, but one thing was clear. I could not ignore what had been done to me, and I would not remain silent any longer. The day after the lab results came in, I felt as though a curtain had been ripped away from my life. What had once been vague suspicion was now undeniable truth, stamped and verified by professionals who had no reason to lie. My brother had been poisoning me, deliberately and systematically, for weeks, maybe months. I stared at the printed report in my hands, my fingers trembling as I traced the chemical name listed in the toxicology findings.
The lab technician had explained that it was a slow-acting compound, capable of causing nausea, headaches, fatigue, and, in larger amounts, organ damage. It wasn't something one could buy accidentally at a grocery store. This wasn't a mistake. It was intentional. The weight of that realization pressed down on me until I could barely breathe. Ethan, the same boy I had played tag with in our backyard, the same young man who had walked me home from school dances, was capable of this. The betrayal was almost as painful as the physical symptoms. That morning, when I came down to the kitchen, Ethan greeted me as though nothing had changed. He was already preparing the coffee, the grinder whirring, and the scent of roasted beans filling the air. "Good morning, Claire," he said casually, handing me a mug with his usual smile. My stomach twisted at the sight of it. This time, I didn't drink. Instead, I set it down on the counter, pretending to be distracted by my phone. He didn't press me, but I noticed the way his eyes flickered for just a second, as though registering my hesitation. It was subtle, but it told me everything I needed to know. He was watching me closely, perhaps testing whether I had caught on. I couldn't risk a direct confrontation, not yet. The results had given me power, but they also gave me responsibility. If I handled this the wrong way, Ethan could destroy evidence, manipulate the family further, or worse, retaliate against me more aggressively. I needed outside eyes, someone beyond my family circle who could see the truth for what it was. Dr. Reynolds came to mind immediately. She had already seen me once for my unexplained symptoms, and now I had documentation that could back up everything I had said. That afternoon, I made an appointment under the guise of a follow-up. I carried the lab report in a sealed folder, rehearsing in my head how I would explain it without sounding hysterical. When I sat across from Dr. Reynolds in her office, the words spilled out faster than I expected. I handed her the toxicology report, my hands shaking as I pointed out the chemical compound that had been identified. She read carefully, her brow furrowing as she scanned the pages. "Claire," she said slowly, looking up at me with concern, "this isn't something that should be in your system at all. This is serious." Hearing her say it out loud sent a shiver through me. For weeks, I had been dismissed as paranoid, accused of exaggeration, even mocked by my family. Now, finally, someone was validating what I had known deep down all along. Dr. Reynolds asked me questions: how long I had been feeling symptoms, whether I had an idea where the exposure was coming from. I hesitated before answering, knowing how wild it would sound, but I couldn't lie. "It's the coffee," I whispered, barely getting the words out. "My brother makes it for me every morning, and every time I drink it, I get sick. When I make my own, I'm fine." Her face went still, her pen hovering above her notepad. "Claire, are you saying you believe your brother is deliberately poisoning you?" she asked gently. I nodded, tears pricking my eyes. Saying it aloud made it feel even more surreal, as if I were confessing to some unspeakable nightmare. But instead of brushing me off, Dr. Reynolds leaned forward, her expression firm. "Then we need to take this very seriously. I'm going to recommend further tests for your blood to check for long-term exposure, and I'll also document these findings in your medical records. If what you're saying is true, this is not just a medical issue. It's potentially criminal." Her words hit me like a shockwave. Criminal. The word made my stomach twist, with both fear and vindication. I left her office with a renewed sense of determination. For the first time, I wasn't alone in this. Someone outside my family circle had acknowledged the truth. That night, I went home and tried to act normal, though every glance from Ethan felt like a blade. At dinner, my parents chatted about mundane things: Lily's school project, Dad's work deadlines, while Ethan made everyone laugh with a story. I watched him, really watched him, noticing how effortlessly he commanded the room, how he played the role of the charming, helpful son, and I realized how easy it would be for him to spin this entire situation against me if I weren't careful. Later that evening, I quietly called Mara, my cousin, the one who had dismissed me before. This time, I spoke with more conviction, armed with evidence. "Mara," I said firmly, "I have proof. Lab results. Ethan has been putting something in my coffee. I'm not imagining it."
She hesitated, and I could almost hear her disbelief through the line, but something in my tone must have convinced her to at least listen. "Claire, are you serious?" she whispered. I told her about the toxicology report, about Dr. Reynolds' reaction, about the blood tests she had ordered. There was a long silence before she finally said, "Okay, okay, I believe you. What are you going to do?" It wasn't full support, but it was a start, a crack in the wall of dismissal I had been trapped behind. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized I had reached a point of no return. I couldn't unknow what I now knew. The results were undeniable, and Dr. Reynolds' validation had given me the courage to push forward. The cover-up, the manipulation, the dismissal, it was all beginning to unravel. Ethan might have thought he was clever, but the truth was starting to surface, and I was no longer just a paranoid sister with vague suspicions. I was someone with evidence, with allies, and with a plan. The next steps would be dangerous, perhaps even life-changing, but they were inevitable. The lies could no longer hold against the weight of proof, and whether Ethan realized it yet or not, his carefully constructed facade was beginning to crack. After leaving Dr. Reynolds' office with the toxicology report tucked firmly in my bag, I felt both validated and unnerved. The confirmation was there, undeniable and irrefutable, but the weight of what it meant pressed down on me harder with each passing hour. I wasn't just documenting odd symptoms anymore. I was in the middle of a deliberate and dangerous scheme orchestrated by my own brother. The reality of it left me lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking of every interaction I had ever had with Ethan. Every laugh we shared, every favor he had done for me, now seemed tainted with an underlying question. Had he been planning this all along, or had it begun recently, born from some grudge I didn't even know existed? The next morning, I avoided the kitchen entirely, instead pouring myself a glass of orange juice in my room and quietly disposing of the untouched coffee Ethan had left waiting for me on the counter. He knocked once on my door later that morning, asking if I had my cup, his voice carrying that familiar lilt of casual concern. "Not today," I called back, forcing my voice to remain light. There was a pause, long enough for me to sense that he was trying to decide how to respond, but he chuckled and said, "Suit yourself." But I knew it wasn't that simple. He was watching me, studying me, perhaps trying to gauge if I was on to him. That paranoia wasn't imagined anymore, it was sharpened by evidence. Dr. Reynolds had ordered blood work, which I had done later that same day. The phlebotomist drew several vials, explaining that they would screen for traces of toxins consistent with what had been found in the coffee samples. I left the clinic with a bandage on my arm and a heart pounding so fast I thought it might leap from my chest. The waiting was agonizing, but I knew I needed more than just lab results on paper. I needed documentation, something tangible that would show Ethan's actions in real time. Gathering evidence became my single focus. I went to a small electronics store in town and bought a discreet camera disguised as a clock, the kind meant for home security. It felt strange, even criminal, to hide it in the kitchen, but I justified it with a single thought. Ethan had already crossed the line into criminal behavior. I positioned the clock on the counter across from the coffee maker, angled perfectly to capture the preparation. My hands shook as I adjusted it, praying he wouldn't notice. That first night, I reviewed the footage obsessively, fast-forwarding through hours of normal activity until finally, there he was, Ethan, carefully leaning over the mugs with something small in his hand, a bottle I didn't recognize. He poured the coffee, added cream, and then discreetly tilted the bottle over the mug that he later handed to me. I froze the frame, my breath catching in my throat. There it was, captured in pixels on my laptop. Proof. The following days were a blur of recording, saving, and cataloging. I stored each clip on a private flash drive that I kept hidden in my purse, labeling the files with dates and times. Each morning, the pattern repeated. Ethan would prepare 2 cups, but only one would receive the extra ingredient. He never once slipped, never once looked directly at the camera, always calm and composed as if he had rehearsed the act. The calmness in his demeanor made the entire thing more chilling, more deliberate. This wasn't an impulsive act of anger, it was a methodical attempt to cause harm over.
As I gathered more evidence, I wrestled with whether to share it with my parents. But every time I considered it, I remembered how dismissive they had been before. To them, Ethan was the golden boy, the reliable son who could do no wrong. I was the dramatic one, the overthinker, the one who always jumped to conclusions. Showing them the footage would likely lead to excuses, maybe even accusations that I had manipulated the recording somehow. Their trust in him was so deeply ingrained that I doubted any single video could break through it. Instead, I focused on building an ironclad case, one that no one could deny. The tension in the house grew unbearable. Ethan's eyes lingered on me longer than usual, his questions more pointed. "You seem tired lately," he remarked one evening as we sat in the living room. "Headache still bothering you?" My heart skipped, wondering if he was probing for signs that his plan was working or if he suspected I had uncovered the truth. I forced a smile, answering vaguely, "Better some days than others." Inside, my mind screamed. He was monitoring me, waiting for confirmation of the damage he was causing. Every word felt like a test, every gesture a clue. Dr. Reynolds called with preliminary blood test results 2 days later. She confirmed what the toxicology report had already suggested. There were measurable traces of the same toxic compound in my system. "Claire," she said carefully, "this isn't a coincidence. Repeated exposure is the only explanation. I'm concerned about the long-term effects, so I'd like to refer you to a specialist for a more thorough evaluation. But I also think you need to consider involving law enforcement." Her words rang in my ears long after I hung up the phone. Law enforcement. The phrase terrified me. Bringing in the police would change everything, shattering my family, exposing Ethan for what he was. But at the same time, I knew she was right. The longer I stayed silent, the more danger I was in. That night, I reviewed the footage again, watching frame after frame of Ethan casually poisoning my coffee, his movements as routine as brushing his teeth. The juxtaposition was surreal. The brother I knew, the one who made jokes at family dinners and offered to help with chores, was also the man who slipped poison into my cup without hesitation. I stared at his image on the screen, my chest tight with grief and fury. Gathering evidence was no longer about proving I wasn't paranoid. It was about survival, about ensuring that he couldn't continue this without consequence. By the end of that week, I had assembled a file that included the toxicology reports, the blood test results, and several days' worth of video footage. I stored it all in a secure folder, both digitally and physically, knowing that one misstep could make it all disappear. Every time Ethan smiled at me across the dinner table, I reminded myself of what was hidden just beneath that smile. The battle lines were drawn, though he didn't yet know how much I had uncovered. The truth was no longer just mine. It was documented, recorded, and undeniable. And though the thought of confrontation made my heart race with fear, I knew that day was coming sooner than either of us could pretend. The night I finally decided to confront the truth head-on began like any other. Ethan prepared dinner, spaghetti with his usual heavy hand on the garlic, and I forced myself to eat, my appetite dulled by the storm raging inside me. I knew what I was sitting on. I had the toxicology reports, the blood work showing toxins in my system, and the footage that captured him tipping that little bottle into my coffee over and over again. There was no ambiguity. The proof was undeniable, a chain of evidence so strong it could convince even the most skeptical observer. Yet what made the reality so much heavier was knowing this wasn't just about me anymore.
Ethan had proven that he was capable of deliberate harm, that his calm exterior masked something calculating and sinister. That realization was the midpoint of everything. There was no turning back from it. I spent that evening in my room after dinner, replanning the videos once again, but this time I didn't fast forward through them. I studied Ethan's body language, the relaxed shoulders, the subtle way he checked the doorway before pouring from the bottle, the faint smirk he wore as he stirred my coffee. It was chilling to realize how normal it all seemed to him, as if poisoning his sister was simply part of his daily routine. He didn't rush, didn't fidget. He was methodical, calm, almost bored. That composure was more terrifying than any burst of anger could have been. It meant he had thought this through, prepared for it, and committed himself fully to it.
The next morning, I skipped the orange juice and pretended to drink the coffee he made for me. I poured it into a travel thermos, smiled at him, and thanked him before leaving the house. But instead of drinking it, I drove directly to Dr. Reynolds' office and handed it over for further analysis. "This is straight from the pot," I told her. She raised her eyebrows, recognizing the urgency in my tone. "We'll expedite it," she promised. As I left her office, I felt like I had crossed another line. This wasn't suspicion anymore. It was action. I was building a case piece by piece, and soon there would be no room for doubt from anyone, not even my parents. Later that week, Dr. Reynolds called me again, her voice steady but firm. "Claire, we tested the coffee you dropped off. It contains ethylene glycol in measurable quantities. Do you understand what that means?" My stomach flipped. Ethylene glycol, antifreeze, a compound that could cause kidney failure, neurological damage, even death if ingested over time. She didn't have to explain further, but she did anyway, her words clinical yet urgent. "This isn't mild. It's lethal. You are lucky your exposure has been spread out in smaller doses, but long-term ingestion could have irreversible consequences. Claire, this is attempted poisoning." Her words hit me like a sledgehammer. Attempted poisoning, not suspicion, not paranoia, an actual crime. It was as though a switch flipped inside me. For weeks, I had doubted myself, wrestled with the possibility that I was exaggerating. But now, there was no room left for doubt. Ethan wasn't just experimenting or playing some sick prank. He was intentionally trying to harm me, and if I hadn't caught on, the end result could have been my death. That night, I couldn't look at him the same way. He brought me a mug, as usual, setting it gently on the counter with his usual casual smile. "Extra cream, just the way you like it," he said. My stomach churned. Every word felt rehearsed, every movement calculated. I mumbled a thank you, my voice shaky, and quickly excused myself before I could betray the fury building inside me. Upstairs, I locked my door and pressed my back against it, shaking as I whispered the truth aloud for the first time. My brother is trying to kill me. Hearing it in my own voice, spoken into the quiet of my room, was the most sobering moment of my life. I couldn't keep this to myself any longer. That night, I called Dr. Reynolds back, my voice trembling. "If I go to the police," I asked, "will they take me seriously?" She didn't hesitate. "Claire, you have physical evidence, documented lab results, and video footage. This isn't speculation, it's proof. If you don't go to them, I'm afraid for your safety." Her unwavering tone cut through my fear like a blade. She was right. I had enough to bring law enforcement into this, but the thought of exposing Ethan, of shattering my family with the truth, felt like carrying a bomb into our lives. Still, I knew the truth couldn't stay hidden forever. My body was already showing signs of exposure. My lab results confirmed it, and the video showed intent. I was living with someone who, day after day, attempted to poison me under the guise of love and care. Pretending otherwise wasn't bravery, it was denial. The evidence had shifted the story from maybe to absolutely, and with that realization, my choices narrowed. Either I confronted him directly, or I let the law do it for me. Both terrified me,
But one thing was certain. The danger was real and the clock was ticking. The next morning, I skipped coffee altogether, making a show of being too rushed to grab a cup. Ethan's expression flickered for a moment. Disappointment, irritation, maybe suspicion. He recovered quickly, but I caught it. For the first time, I could see through the mask he wore. The casual, easygoing brother was an illusion. Beneath it was someone calculating enough to hide poison in plain sight, patient enough to wait weeks for the damage to build. That glimpse of his true face, the tiny crack in his facade, cemented my resolve. That day marked the turning point in my story. The proof wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to science, to the lens of a camera, to the cold clarity of a lab report. Ethan's plan was real, documented, and undeniable. And though fear clawed at me from every direction, I knew there was no way to pretend otherwise. The truth had shifted from suspicion to certainty, and certainty demanded action. The hardest part of carrying the truth wasn't the knowledge itself, but the silence it demanded. Every time I sat at the dinner table across from Ethan, I had to fight to keep my composure. His smile, his casual jokes, his lighthearted chatter, it all felt like a mask stretched over something monstrous. And the fact that my parents sat there, utterly oblivious, made the weight of my secret almost unbearable. They adored him, always had. Ethan had been the golden child, the one who charmed teachers, excelled at sports, and made them proud at every turn. Compared to him, I had always been the cautious one, the worrier, the child who hesitated where he leapt. Now, trying to convince them that their beloved son was systematically poisoning me felt like tearing down the foundation of our entire family with my bare hands.
Still, I knew I couldn't hide forever. The toxicology results, the footage, the worsening toll on my health, it was too big to shoulder alone. If something happened to me before I acted, the truth might die with me. One evening, after my parents had returned from church, I sat them down in the living room. The house smelled faintly of pot roast and lemon cleaner, the normalcy of it almost mocking the storm raging inside me. My mother noticed my pale face immediately. "Claire, honey, are you all right? You've been looking so tired lately." I took a deep breath, my hands trembling in my lap. "There's something I need to tell you," I said, my voice low but steady. At first, they listened. I explained how I'd been feeling sick for weeks, how the symptoms didn't match ordinary stress or fatigue. I told them about the blood tests, the toxins in my system, the doctor's warnings. I even told them about the cameras I had set up in the kitchen, how they captured Ethan pouring something into my coffee. My father frowned deeply, his brow furrowing as though he was trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't quite fit. My mother shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes before I had even reached the part about the lab confirming the poison. When I finally said the words, "Ethan has been poisoning me," the silence that followed was deafening. My mother was the first to break. "Claire, that's ridiculous," she said, her voice shaking with disbelief. "You've always had an overactive imagination. You're under so much stress right now, with work, with everything. Don't you think maybe you're exaggerating?" I stared at her in shock. "Exaggerating? Mom, I have lab results. I have video evidence. It's not my imagination." My father leaned forward, his tone calmer but no less dismissive. "Sweetheart, you know how close you and Ethan are. He'd never do something like that. Poison? That's extreme. Maybe you misinterpreted what you saw. Maybe it was medicine or a supplement. He's always mixing things into his own drinks." I felt my chest tighten with frustration, my heart pounding as I realized they weren't hearing me at all. "Dad, it's ethylene glycol. Antifreeze. That's not a supplement. That's poison. And it's in my system right now." My words cracked as I said them, the desperation in my tone finally breaking through. My mother clasped her hands together, shaking her head as though trying to physically reject the idea. Ethan loves you, Claire. He makes your coffee every morning. That's not the act of someone trying to hurt you. You're not well, and you're seeing things that aren't there. The sting of their words hit harder than I expected. Here I was, presenting undeniable proof, and still, they chose denial over belief. I felt like I was drowning, reaching for a lifeline that my own parents refused to throw. So, you think I made this up? I snapped, my voice rising. Do you think I forged lab results? Do you think I edited videos for fun? My father's expression hardened, his tone shifting from calm to stern. We think you need help, Claire. Real help. This obsession with Ethan, it's not healthy. You've been withdrawn, paranoid. Maybe therapy would... Therapy? I interrupted, standing to my feet, my entire body trembling with rage and fear. I don't need therapy. I need protection. Ethan is trying to kill me, and if you don't believe me, then you're choosing him over me. My mother began to cry. My father rubbed his temples, and the whole room felt like it was collapsing around me. The rejection was worse than anything Ethan had done. At least with him, the betrayal was hidden, insidious. But with my parents, it was clear, blunt, and absolute. They didn't believe me. I stormed upstairs, slamming my bedroom door shut and locking it. For hours, I sat on my bed with my laptop open, replaying the footage again and again, as though trying to remind myself that I wasn't crazy, that the evidence was real. Every time Ethan appeared on screen with that calm, chilling demeanor, I felt both vindicated and sickened. The truth was there, clear as day, but the people who should have protected me, who should have believed me without hesitation, had turned their backs. Later that night, as I lay awake listening to the house settle, I heard Ethan's footsteps in the hallway. He paused outside my door for a moment, long enough to make my skin crawl, before continuing down the stairs. My parents' denial had given him the perfect cover. As far as they were concerned, I was the unstable one, the paranoid daughter, while he was still their golden boy. That realization was more dangerous than the poison itself, because now Ethan knew I was onto him, and he also knew no one else would believe me. The next morning, when he greeted me with his usual cheerful, "Coffee's ready, sis," I saw through the words. It wasn't kindness, it was control. He was reminding me that he still held the upper hand, that my silence and my parents' blindness left me isolated. But as I stared back at him, forcing a smile while my insides churned, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't let his mask fool me, and I wouldn't let my parents' denial silence me. The evidence was real, and one way or another, I would find someone who would believe me.
The days following my parents' dismissal of my warnings were some of the darkest of my life. It wasn't just the poison that was draining me anymore. It was the crushing weight of isolation. Every time I looked at Ethan, I saw the smirk just barely hidden in his eyes, the satisfaction of knowing he had successfully manipulated not just me, but everyone around us. And every time I looked at my parents, I saw doubt, pity, and quiet judgment. They thought I was unraveling, when the truth was that I had never been clearer in my life. The danger was real. It was in my bloodstream, and it was sitting across from me at the dinner table every night. My symptoms grew worse, and there were days when standing upright felt like a battle. My hands trembled uncontrollably when I tried to write. My vision blurred during long drives, and nausea hit me in waves so fierce I often had to excuse myself from conversations. Ethan would always look concerned, tilting his head with feigned sympathy. "Claire, maybe you should see a doctor," he would say, pretending he hadn't already condemned me to a slow, suffocating sickness. My parents would nod along, their faces clouded with misplaced worry, thinking I was fragile or unstable. They didn't see the predator among them, but I did, and that knowledge burned like acid in my chest. It was in that haze of despair
that I started to notice just how carefully Ethan orchestrated everything. He was deliberate about timing, offering to make me coffee when no one else was around, hovering nearby with just enough charm and helpfulness to disguise his real intentions. He left no traces, no obvious clues. It was only because of the camera I had hidden that I had proof at all, and even that proof had been dismissed by my own family. It was as though he knew exactly how far he could push me without tipping the balance. He didn't need to win me over. He just needed everyone else to doubt me enough that my voice would carry no weight. And it was working. One night, I sat awake in my room staring at the shadows on the ceiling as a storm rattled the windows outside. My thoughts spun relentlessly, circling around the same haunting questions. What if no one ever believed me? What if I couldn't prove it in time? What if Ethan succeeded and my death was written off as an illness or stress-induced collapse? My parents would grieve, but they'd never see the truth. They'd mourn me and still embrace him, the very person who had orchestrated my end. That thought kept me from sleep, gnawing at me until I felt hollow. The following morning, I decided not to drink the coffee Ethan offered. His eyebrows lifted ever so slightly when I declined, but he covered it with a shrug. Suit yourself, more for me. He took a long, exaggerated sip from his own mug, and though I knew it was a performance meant to mock me, the act only confirmed what I already knew. He was still doing it, not stopping, not even after my confrontation with our parents. If anything, he seemed emboldened by their dismissal, as though their denial had given him even more freedom. I began secretly discarding any food or drink he gave me, pouring the coffee down the sink when no one was looking, pushing meals around my plate until I could dump them discreetly into the trash. My parents noticed my dwindling appetite, and their whispers grew louder. "She's getting thinner," my mother whispered to my father one evening when she thought I was upstairs. "I'm worried about her. She's wasting away." "It's stress," my father replied, his voice low. "Maybe therapy is the best answer. She needs help before she hurts herself." Their words stung almost as much as the poison. I was fighting to survive, and the people I loved most thought I was destroying myself. The suffocating loneliness finally broke me down one night when I locked myself in the bathroom. I stared at my reflection, pale and hollow-eyed, and I hardly recognized the person looking back at me. My lips trembled as tears streamed down my cheeks. "Why me?" I whispered to the mirror. "Why would he do this?" I tried to piece it together. Was it jealousy, hatred, some hidden resentment he had carried for years? Or was it just power, the thrill of control? The not knowing was almost worse than the act itself. I wanted to scream, to break everything around me, but all I could do was sob quietly into my hands, terrified of making noise that would draw Ethan's attention. But somewhere in the midst of that breakdown, a spark ignited. I realized that if I didn't fight, I would die. My parents weren't going to save me, and Ethan was certainly not going to stop. The only person who could put an end to this nightmare was me. It wasn't enough to have proof. I needed undeniable, irrefutable evidence that no one could dismiss. Something so concrete that even my parents, blinded by love for their son, would have no choice but to see the truth.
The idea came to me in fragments at first, a messy plan that solidified over the course of the following days. I started documenting everything meticulously, my symptoms, the times I drank the coffee, the reactions that followed. I kept a journal, writing down every detail, every pattern I noticed. I even began saving samples of the coffee, pouring them into sealed jars and hiding them in my room. If Ethan was going to continue, then I would use his persistence against him. I would build a case so strong it would be impossible to ignore. Still, the danger grew with each passing day. My health was deteriorating, and though I was discarding the coffee whenever I could, there were moments I slipped. Sips taken absent-mindedly before I could stop myself, bites of food eaten without thinking. Each mistake left me dizzy, nauseated, weaker than before. It was a race against time.
a battle between my determination to expose him and the poison slowly wearing down my body. Ethan's confidence only made things worse. One evening, he leaned casually against the kitchen counter, watching me as I washed dishes. "You're looking pale, Claire," he said, his voice light but edged with something darker. "Maybe you should get that checked out. Wouldn't want you to waste away." His eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew he was testing me, taunting me. He wanted me to know he was in control, that he could toy with me without consequence. But what he didn't realize was that his arrogance was giving me strength. His little games, his mocking words, they fueled my resolve. I might have been isolated, sick, and ignored by my family, but I wasn't broken. Not yet. And as I lay awake that night listening to the storm outside, I promised myself again, I would survive this. I would expose him, and when the truth finally came out, the world would see Ethan for who he really was. The turning point came when I realized that my documentation alone wouldn't be enough. I had my journal, the jars of coffee samples, and a growing pattern of symptoms that matched poisoning, but in the eyes of my parents, it was all just my interpretation. They needed something undeniable, something scientific, something beyond my words. That was when I decided to involve a professional, even if it meant doing so behind everyone's back. One afternoon, when Ethan was out running errands with my father, I slipped away to a small independent lab across town. I had taken 2 of the jars with me, the liquid sealed tightly inside. The receptionist raised an eyebrow at my pale face and trembling hands as I explained I needed a private toxicology test. I didn't offer details, just that I suspected contamination. She didn't ask questions. She simply accepted the samples, had me sign a few forms, and told me they would contact me when the results were ready. It was a risk, but it was one I had to take. The waiting nearly killed me. Every day that passed, I felt weaker, but I forced myself to act as though nothing had changed. I accepted Ethan's offers with a smile, only to pour them out in secret. I nodded along with my parents when they voiced concern over my appearance, though I bit my tongue to keep from snapping at them for their blindness. My hands shook constantly, not just from the lingering poison, but from the sheer tension of living in this charade. Ethan, meanwhile, grew bolder. He would linger in the kitchen, hovering just a little too close, his smirk daring me to speak up again. He seemed almost amused by my silence, as though he believed he had broken me completely. But what he didn't realize was that I was playing the long game now. 2 weeks later, the call finally came. I nearly dropped the phone when the lab assistant told me, in careful but unmistakable words, that the samples contained traces of heavy metal toxins. My blood turned cold as she listed the levels, explaining that while the amounts were not immediately lethal, consistent exposure could cause severe long-term damage, even death. I thanked her in a voice that shook, and when I hung up, I sat on my bed in stunned silence. My worst fear had been confirmed, but along with the fear came a strange, fierce relief. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't imagining this. I had proof. Real, undeniable proof. The question now was what to do with it. Part of me wanted to rush downstairs, slam the report on the dining table, and scream the truth until my parents had no choice but to listen. But another part of me knew that Ethan wouldn't go down quietly. If I confronted him too soon, if I revealed my hand without preparation, he would find a way to twist it. He had always been one step ahead, manipulating perceptions, bending reality until even my parents doubted their own daughter. No, this had to be done carefully. I had to expose him in a way that left no room for excuses, no time for him to spin lies.
I started planning with meticulous detail. I continued to gather more samples, taking small amounts of everything Ethan prepared for me. I bought a hidden recorder and began capturing our conversations, hoping to catch him slipping, even just slightly. I rehearsed what I would say when the time came, visualized the moment over and over again. My body was weak, but my mind was sharper than ever. Every interaction became a calculated move in a game I refused to lose. Ethan thought he had me trapped, but in reality, he was walking straight into my snare. The tension in the house grew thicker as I carried out my silent preparations. My parents remained oblivious, chalking up the strained atmosphere to my health crisis. Ethan, however, seemed to sense something had shifted. One evening, he handed me a cup of coffee, his eyes glinting as he said, "I made it just the way you like it." I forced myself to smile and lift the cup to my lips, pretending to sip before setting it down. His gaze lingered on me, probing, almost suspicious. For the first time, I wondered if he suspected I was onto him. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but I didn't let it show. If he had even the slightest inkling, the danger doubled. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling once more, but this time I wasn't consumed by despair. I was consumed by resolve. The plan was taking shape in my mind, a vision so vivid it felt like destiny. I wouldn't just confront Ethan privately, I would expose him in front of my parents, in a way so undeniable that even their love for him couldn't shield him. They needed to see the monster with their own eyes, to watch the mask slip from his face. Only then would the truth finally pierce through their denial. My opportunity arrived sooner than I expected. My mother announced that we would all have dinner together that weekend, a family night, meant to ease the tension that had been growing between us. Ethan, of course, offered to cook. My parents beamed, delighted by his helpfulness, while I forced a smile, hiding the storm raging inside me. This was it, the perfect stage. If Ethan was going to lace the food again, I would be ready. And this time, I wouldn't just have suspicion or words. I would have evidence. In the days leading up to that dinner, I prepared obsessively. I set up a new hidden camera in the kitchen, angled perfectly to capture the counter where Ethan usually worked. I made sure my recorder was fully charged and concealed on me at all times. I reviewed the toxicology results until I could recite them word for word. This was no longer about survival. It was about justice, about reclaiming the voice Ethan had stolen from me. The evening of the dinner, the house smelled of roasted chicken and herbs, Ethan's chosen menu. My parents chatted happily, sipping wine, blissfully unaware of the predator in their midst. I sat at the table, heart hammering so loudly I could hardly hear their words. Ethan moved smoothly through the kitchen, carving the chicken with exaggerated precision, arranging potatoes and greens on plates as though he were a trained chef performing for an audience. His charm radiated outward, masking the rot beneath, and my parents soaked it up with the same blind admiration they always had. But I didn't see the charming brother they adored. I saw the man who had been poisoning me day after day, smiling as my body weakened. And tonight, I was going to tear that mask from his face. When he set the plate down in front of me, his eyes locked on mine. The glint was there again, that cruel little sparkle that dared me to question him. My stomach twisted, but I didn't flinch. I thanked him softly, lifting my fork, pretending to play my part. All the while, the small recorder in my pocket buzzed against my ribs like a second heartbeat, capturing every sound. The camera I had hidden earlier was already recording, its tiny lens peering from the corner shelf, aimed perfectly at the counter where Ethan had been working. My parents didn't notice. They were too busy gushing about how thoughtful Ethan was for cooking such a beautiful meal.
The first bite of chicken felt like lead in my mouth. I chewed slowly, forcing myself to swallow. I wasn't afraid of what might be in it. I had no intention of eating much tonight. What terrified me was timing. One wrong move, one misstep, and the entire plan would unravel. I needed Ethan to make the mistake himself, to let his arrogance pull him into the trap I had prepared. For several long minutes, the dinner unfolded like any other. My parents laughing, asking Ethan about his week, praising him for being such a blessing to the family. I sat quietly, waiting, my heart pounding so hard it nearly drowned out their voices. Then, as the plates emptied, my chance finally arrived. I set down my fork and cleared my throat. "Actually," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "there's something I need to bring up tonight. Something important." My father looked up, eyebrows knitting with mild annoyance at my interruption. My mother tilted her head, concerned. Ethan froze, just slightly, before recovering, leaning back casually in his chair. "Of course, Claire," he said smoothly. "What's on your mind?" I reached into my bag and pulled out the folded lab report. My hands trembled, but my voice was clear. This is what's on my mind. Toxicology results from coffee samples I submitted. They came back positive for heavy metal poisoning. The words dropped like stones into water, shattering the easy atmosphere. My parents exchanged startled looks, their smiles faltering. Ethan's face remained composed, but I saw the tiniest flicker of tension in his jaw. "Claire," my mother said gently, her voice tinged with worry. "Are you sure? Maybe this is some kind of mistake." "It's not a mistake," I cut in sharply. "I've been documenting everything. Every symptom, every time Ethan brought me coffee, every change in my body. And now I have scientific proof. He's been poisoning me." The room fell into stunned silence. My father leaned forward, frowning, while my mother pressed a hand to her chest, pale with disbelief. Ethan, however, let out a low chuckle, shaking his head as though I had just told a ridiculous joke. "Poisoning you?" he repeated, his tone mocking. "Claire, listen to yourself. This is absurd. You've been sick, yes, but to accuse me of something like that?" He glanced at my parents, his expression one of wounded innocence. I think we can all agree she's not herself lately. For a moment, I thought my parents might actually believe him again. Their eyes darted between us, torn between loyalty and confusion. But I had prepared for this. I pulled out my phone, setting it on the table. "I've been recording," I said, my tone calm but firm. "Every conversation, every time you hinted, every time you smirked when I turned down your drinks. You think I don't notice, Ethan? But I do. And now, so will they." His mask cracked, just slightly. His lips tightened, his eyes narrowing for a fleeting second before he smoothed his face back into its calm facade. "You've been recording me?" he said softly, his voice a dangerous purr. "That's quite the invasion of privacy." "It's survival," I shot back. My father raised a hand, his voice shaking. This is insane. Are you both serious right now?" "Yes," I said fiercely. "Deadly serious. Dad, Mom, I know it's hard to believe. I know you love him. But you need to open your eyes. He isn't who you think he is. He's been hurting me, right under your noses." My mother's face crumpled, torn between horror and denial. "Ethan, tell me this isn't true." And then, at last, the slip I had been waiting for. He leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. "Do you really think they'll believe you over me, Claire? You're weak. You've always been weak. They'll side with me because I'm the one they can rely on." The words hung in the air, sharp and damning. My parents' faces drained of color. My father pushed his chair back slowly, his eyes fixed on Ethan with a mix of fury and betrayal. My mother covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Ethan looked unsettled. His smug confidence faltered, his eyes darting between us, calculating his next move. The confrontation had begun, and for the first time, the power had shifted. He wasn't the predator anymore. He was exposed, cornered, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes.
Socially, I noticed a profound shift in how people interacted with me. Friends, neighbors, and even extended family treated me with renewed respect. Those who had doubted my courage now acknowledged the strength and perseverance required to stand up against manipulation and intimidation. The experience had inadvertently turned me into a model of resilience for peers who were navigating their own familial pressures or personal challenges. I began receiving messages of gratitude and encouragement from those who saw in my story a reflection of struggles they themselves had faced. It was humbling to realize that my personal journey could inspire others to confront injustice in their own lives and reclaim control over their circumstances. Within my immediate family, the dynamics had changed irreversibly. My father, having witnessed the necessity of assertive action, engaged more thoughtfully with me, offering support in practical ways without overstepping boundaries. I could see him adjusting, slowly, learning to respect my decisions without needing to mediate every conflict. My mother, on the other hand, had become a cautionary example of the limits of manipulation and control. Her attempts to dominate and intimidate had ultimately isolated her, demonstrating to me and everyone around that power achieved through coercion was fragile and unsustainable. The lesson was clear. Integrity and courage endure where manipulation and fear crumble. The legal confirmation of the trust fund also brought a tangible sense of security and responsibility. I began managing it with care, consulting advisors, and planning investments that aligned with my long-term goals. Every decision reinforced my independence, teaching me financial literacy, strategic thinking, and the consequences of informed action. Unlike before, the fund no longer represented conflict or familial tension. It was a resource that reflected my agency, my ability to make thoughtful choices, and my commitment to honoring the legacy of my grandparents. It became a symbol not just of material inheritance, but of empowerment, foresight, and personal accountability. Beyond finances, the emotional and psychological growth I experienced was transformative. I had faced intense fear, public humiliation, and the overwhelming pressure of standing against someone who had long held power over me. Emerging from that crucible with clarity and self-respect instilled a profound sense of confidence that permeated all aspects of life. Decisions that once caused anxiety were now approached with deliberate thought and courage. Challenges, whether social, academic, or personal, were met with resilience, informed by the understanding that truth, preparation, and steadfastness could overcome even the most daunting obstacles. I also made a conscious decision to use my experience to help others. I began mentoring younger peers who were navigating difficult family dynamics, sharing strategies for asserting boundaries, understanding legal protections, and cultivating emotional resilience. My story became a resource, a living example of the power of preparation, truth, and self-advocacy. I realized that transformation wasn't solely about reclaiming what had been threatened. It was about using lessons learned to empower others, creating a ripple effect of courage and integrity that extended far beyond my immediate circumstances. Over time, even seemingly ordinary moments took on new significance. Celebrating achievements, enjoying quiet evenings with friends, and making autonomous decisions about my future all carried the weight of hard-earned freedom. The house, once a place of tension and intimidation, had become a space where I could think, plan, and grow without constant fear. Each room seemed infused with a quiet sense of possibility, reflecting the transformation not just of my circumstances, but of my perspective, resilience, and identity. In reflection, I understood that the journey from intimidation to autonomy, from fear to empowerment, had been as much about internal growth as external validation. The confrontation, the legal confirmation, and the eventual stabilization of family dynamics were milestones along a larger path of personal transformation. I had claimed more than a financial inheritance. I had claimed my voice, my autonomy, and my right to define my life on my own terms. The experience had solidified my belief in the power of courage, preparation, and integrity. And it had equipped me with the confidence to face future challenges with clarity and resolve. As I looked toward the future, I saw a life brimming with potential. My independence was no longer a point of contention, it was an established reality. The lessons I had learned about courage, truth, and personal empowerment would guide every decision I made. I felt an enduring sense of peace and purpose,
knowing that I had faced adversity, stood firm in my convictions, and emerged stronger, wiser, and fully in control of my destiny. The final image of my journey was not just the legal confirmation of a trust fund, but the embodiment of transformation itself. A young woman who had claimed her voice, embraced her autonomy, and stepped confidently into a life of empowerment, integrity, and hope. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.
The seconds after Ethan's threat stretched endlessly, the silence broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. My father didn't hesitate. With one steady movement, he pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed, his voice calm but firm as he requested police assistance. Ethan's face contorted into something between disbelief and rage, his composure finally shattering completely. He lunged forward, as if to snatch the phone away, but my father held his ground, his eyes locked with his son's in an unspoken challenge. For a moment, it was as though they were strangers staring each other down, the mask of brotherhood and family forever destroyed. My mother clutched my arm tightly, trembling as we both stood frozen in the corner. I could feel her heart racing as hard as mine. Ethan's fury spilled over into words, spitting accusations, curses, and denials that tangled together in incoherent bursts. "You'll regret this," he growled, pacing like a caged animal. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? You're throwing away everything I've built, everything I've done for you." But there was no longer any illusion of loyalty left, only the truth we had finally unearthed. When the knock came at the door minutes later, sharp and commanding, Ethan froze. His eyes flicked toward the sound, and for the first time that night, I saw a flash of fear break through his rage. My father opened the door to 2 officers, their presence filling the room with an authority Ethan could not defy. "That's him," my father said firmly, pointing at Ethan. "He threatened us. He tried to harm my daughter." Ethan laughed bitterly, shaking his head, but the fight had already drained from him. The officers moved quickly, securing him before he could lash out again. His words echoed as they led him away, hollow threats about how we'd regret turning on him, how we'd never be safe without him, but his voice grew fainter as the night swallowed him into the patrol car's headlights. The house felt eerily still after he was gone. My mother collapsed into a chair, sobbing quietly, while my father stood motionless, staring at the door as though he could still see his son standing there. I sat beside them, exhausted but steady, finally breathing freely for the first time in years. The darkness that had haunted us was gone, and in its place was silence, heavy but healing. The scars would remain, yes, but so would the truth, and the truth had set me free.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.